Day after day, week after week, Ukraine faces constant and increasingly intensive drone strikes from Russia. It's all part of President Vladimir Putin's plan to wear down the enemy with a seemingly endless barrage of buzzing drones, raining down fire on people, buildings, and military vehicles like tanks, personnel carriers, and fighting vehicles. But Ukraine just changed the game and sent Putin into a major meltdown in the process. It created insanely innovative rubber armor, which might just be enough to make its military vehicles more or less drone-proof from this point on. This exciting news comes courtesy of open source intelligence analyst Andrew Perpetua. Analysts like Andrew spend much of their time poring over satellite images, military videos, and other open source media they can find to uncover insights about the war, often revealing some fascinating facts in the process. While watching a Russian military video of a drone barrage on a Ukrainian military vehicle, most likely a US supplied Striker, Andrew noticed something extraordinary. The Striker had been equipped with slat armor, with a thick layer of rubber sitting on top, followed by a second layer of slat armor on top of the rubber. This three-layer shield proved remarkably effective, turning the Striker into, in Andrew's words, an invincible tank. According to the analysts, the Striker was able to take multiple drone hits without suffering a single sliver of damage in the process. It just kept rolling thanks to its protective rubber shell. Andrew shared a screenshot of the vehicle in question, along with the caption, "I was too busy to talk about this the other day, but there was a Russian video attacking Ukrainian Striker that Ukraine turned into an invincible tank. This Striker ate every single goddamn drone Russia sent at it without even taking a scratch." The armor plan was this: you take a Striker with the slat armor on top of the slat armor you apply a thick layer of rubber all over, whole vehicle is now rubber. Then take slat armor and put that over the rubber. It went Striker, slat, rubber, slat. Andrew later admitted in a separate post that the vehicle may not necessarily have been a Striker, noting that it might have been a Soviet-era BTR instead. Could be a command variant of a BTR or something. It honestly doesn't really matter what it is, because this armor layout tanked like 8 FPV drones in a row with no damage at all. The thing was driving down streets and across fields, eating drones all morning. Either way, whether it's a BTR, a Striker, or even something else, the important takeaway here is that Ukraine managed to make an infantry vehicle seemingly invulnerable against drone attacks. That's a huge accomplishment at a time when the conflict is so heavily dominated by drone warfare. July, for example, saw the most drone strikes on Ukraine ever, with more than 6,000 drones launched in total. That's a 16% increase from June, and it's 14 times more than July 2024, which shows just how much Russia has come to rely on drones as the war has progressed. It regularly launches hundreds of them over the course of a single day or night, often targeting civilian structures rather than military bases. July's drone strikes, for instance, caused damage to family homes, a kindergarten, and an ambulance, with dozens of civilians killed and many more injured. The country is also producing record numbers of drones at its massive plants, like the Yelabuga drone factory. There, the Kremlin has even put teenagers to work, with some as young as 15 years of age, in order to achieve its production targets, churning out hundreds of days and thousands each month, with many sent straight to the front lines to be used in strikes on Ukrainian cities like Kyiv and Kherson. There's no doubt about it, Russia has gone all in on drone warfare. Putin and his Kremlin cronies clearly feel that drones are the best way to bring about some sort of victory, since they're reasonably cheap to make, easy to work with, and can, bit by bit, wear away at Ukrainian morale and resolve. Drones have also historically been very effective at taking out high-value targets like tanks and military vehicles. That's something that both sides thoroughly understand, as Ukraine has repeatedly used relatively cheap and simple drones to wipe out Russian targets like $100 million radar stations, main battle tanks, bombers, and infantry fighting vehicles. Russia too, despite being more wasteful with its drones in general, has carried out plenty of successful strikes on Ukrainian vehicles. But this new rubber armor could prove to be a game changer. If Ukraine can equip its other vehicles or even tanks with a protective rubber coating, it could render Russia's drone strikes effectively worthless. While only one vehicle's performance has been documented so far, and it's unclear whether all weak points like hatches or sensors are protected, the idea is that drones will have no way of penetrating the rubber barrier to strike vehicle weak points, allowing the likes of BMPs, Strikers and more to operate in hotly contested frontline territories without the same level of risk they have faced in the past. What's more, rubber isn't exactly an expensive material globally, so Ukraine could easily and cheaply lay its hands on large amounts of rubber to retrofit its vehicle fleet. Of course, this innovative rubber shield isn't perfect. Adding any sort of armor, be it slats, cages, spikes or rubber layers, to a tank or armored vehicle always has the same downside: it makes the vehicle heavier. And with extra weight on their backs, these kinds of vehicles tend to become more difficult to maneuver. As such, if Ukraine does go ahead and rubberize part of its military fleet, it will have to cope with the fact that the extra protection comes at a cost of reduced mobility. However, it's still better to have a vehicle that is a little bit more cumbersome and bulky but able to take serious damage and stay in one piece, rather than one that gets blown up by a single drone. The rubber protection adds longevity, survivability and strength. It gives Ukraine's vehicles much more of a fighting chance to remain intact and deal damage to the enemy, particularly in areas that are prone to drone strikes. As Andrew notes, "This has to be the heaviest goddamn striker to ever strike. That little porker probably weighs as much as a goddamn Abrams, but it ate drones like no tomorrow." And this all ties in perfectly with Ukraine's overarching strategy, which focuses on making the most of the resources at its disposal and extracting as much value as it can from its weapons, defenses and vehicles. From day one of this war, Ukraine has understood it cannot match Russia for numbers. Its army doesn't have as many soldiers, nor does it have as many tanks, armored vehicles, jets, bombers, ships, artillery units or air defense systems to call on. When it comes to quantity, Russia wins every single time. But in war, quantity is no guarantee of success. It's not always the case that the side with the biggest army always wins. There are countless examples throughout history of smaller forces that are simply strategically superior and able to use their resources to effectively outwit and outmatch larger opponents. And that's exactly what Ukraine wants to do, and it's what it has been doing so well over the last 3.5 years. It's used its own resources, as well as those generously supplied by allies like the US and the countries of the European Union, to great effect. It's treated its weapons and pieces of military equipment with care, doing its best to make each one count. When it receives batches of missiles or new defensive systems from its NATO allies, for example, Ukraine doesn't simply blast them all into Russia or deploy them in dangerous locations along the front lines. It bides its time, fine-tunes its strategy, and plans its move with calculated precision. That's how it's able to conduct awe-inspiring attacks like Operation Spiderweb and other amazing strikes deep in Russian territory, taking out multiple high-value targets to weaken the Kremlin's war machine from within. It's the complete opposite of Russia, which has been notoriously wasteful with its resources throughout the entire war so far. In the early days of the conflict, for example, Russia lost massive amounts of tanks and armored vehicles because of poor decision-making and bad planning. It routinely sent tanks into difficult territory or straight into Ukrainian ambushes, and its losses quickly mounted up. It also wastes the vast majority of the drones and missiles it sends into Ukraine, since so many are shot down by air defense systems and interceptors, failing to deal even a small amount of damage. Russia, and Putin, is all about brute force. It throws everything it has at Ukraine in an attempt to overwhelm and pile pressure on its opposition. It doesn't seem to care about the cost, as even Putin appears unflustered by the fact that more than 1 million of his soldiers have been killed or wounded in the conflict so far. It's that wasteful, reckless attitude that's resulted in Russia being in perhaps its worst position of the war so far. Its casualties are skyrocketing, its equipment losses are staggering, and its economy is falling apart. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues not only to resist, but to innovate and find ways to counterattack its enemy's plans. This, after all, is a highly dynamic conflict. It's changed so much over time, transitioning from traditional trench warfare and vehicle-based assaults in the early stages to a more futuristic clash of drones and electronic warfare technologies in more recent times. Both sides have had to adapt to the changes, and Ukraine has done a much better job of that than Russia. It has consistently and successfully found ways to take its enemy by surprise and catch them off guard, both offensively and defensively. The rubber armor is just the latest example of that, and if used well, it could provide real value for Ukraine's armed forces moving forward, especially at a time when vehicles appear to be re-entering the fray. For some time now, Russia has preferred to keep its tanks and armored vehicles safe and sound, deep in its own territory, far from the front lines. This is mostly due to the fact that so many of those vehicles were wiped out in the first couple of years of the war. The Kremlin realized it was sustaining unsustainable losses, so its commanders rewrote their doctrines, keeping the tanks back and sending infantry into Ukrainian territory on foot or aboard cheap, simple civilian vehicles like motorbikes and quad bikes. There were small pros but serious cons to this strategy. On the one hand, it kept Russia's more valuable vehicles safe and gave them time to make new ones, as well as digging old Soviet units out of storage facilities. On the other hand, it put their soldiers in serious jeopardy. On several occasions, Russian soldiers have been seen without any serious vehicle support, having to face off against Ukrainian armor like Bradley fighting vehicles. Recently, in Sumy for example, Russia appeared to believe it had cleared out an area near Kindrativka after an intense bombing run. It ordered its troops to advance, but they soon found themselves face to face with a Ukrainian convoy of infantry vehicles and were forced to turn tail and flee back to their homeland. Perhaps because of humiliating losses like that, the Kremlin has recently appeared to rewrite the rulebook all over again. It started sending in tanks and other armored vehicles in key locations along the front lines, like near Pokrovsk and Siversk, both in the Donetsk region. Fortunately, Ukraine was able to wipe out most of those vehicles, thanks once again to a combination of Ukrainian smart strategic planning and Russian wastefulness. But more vehicles are likely to follow, and Ukraine will need to be ready. It can use drones, missiles, and innovative weapons like bonus artillery shells to hold the line and take out big targets, but it might also need to go toe-to-toe with Russian steel using vehicles of its own, like Strykers, Bradleys, and even tanks. Valuable improvements like rubber armor could push the odds of those clashes in Ukraine's favor, giving an all-important edge in upcoming assaults and defensive maneuvers. On the other side of the divide, the Russians are also trying out new and somewhat unusual methods to protect their vehicles against Ukrainian drones. Just recently, on July 31st, another open-source intelligence analyst, who goes by the name Special Kherson Cat, posted an image of a so-called Russian monster turtle tank. The tank looks like something from the pages of a comic book or some sort of post-apocalyptic wasteland. It's absolutely covered from top to bottom in a mixture of spiky quills, barbed wire, grill-like armor, and metal sheeting. Yet again, the Russians have gone all in, seemingly throwing any piece of scrap metal they can find onto this tank in a desperate hope to keep it from being blown up by one of Ukraine's highly skilled drone operators. But does it actually work? Well, the armor could technically provide some benefit, and it's not the first time Russia's been seen trying these kinds of tactics. It famously created so-called turtle tanks, which are basically old Soviet-era tanks that have been covered up with improvised anti-drone on the tops and sides. This makes them look somewhat similar to turtles, hence the name, and the extra armor can prove effective at soaking up blast damage from enemy drones. Some have even been able to take multiple drone hits and keep on rolling. This new monster turtle takes things to another level. The spiky quills are likely to intended to strike any drones that get close, making them blow up before they actually come into contact with the body of the tank, reducing their impact and effectiveness. Theoretically, up-armored vehicles like this one are much more resilient than conventional counterparts, capable of taking multiple drone hits without being destroyed. But there are several major problems. First, the aforementioned weight issue. Tanks are already incredibly heavy, with many Russian models like the T-90M tipping the scales at around 46 to 48 metric tons. These tanks are not exactly famed for their mobility. Many of them are quite awkward to maneuver, often getting stuck on rough or uneven ground and being very slow when turning and reversing. When adding huge amounts of additional metal on top of these types of tanks, their mobility issues are compounded. They become significantly harder to drive. That in turn can make them easier targets for other anti-tank weaponry like mines and rocket launchers, which Ukraine has plenty of. Second, there's undoubtedly a visibility issue with this design. With all those spikes, plates, and other bits and pieces scattered across the tank's chassis, the driver is almost guaranteed to have a hard time seeing their surroundings. So, not only will they have to deal with the extra weight bogging them down as they attempt to wind their way along narrow roads or into enemy towns and cities, they'll also be unable to see where they're going or what hazards might be lying ahead. This again makes these tanks far less likely to survive in contested frontline territories. And then the question has to be asked, how are tank crew members even supposed to get in and out of that thing? Tanks like this tend to have 3 crew members, a commander, a driver, and a gunner. That's 3 people plus possible passengers who will need to climb on and weave their way through all those spikes and points to enter the tank and take up their positions without getting pierced in the process. And imagine if the tank got hit and a fire broke out. The crew might only have a matter of seconds to escape before being burned alive, but would have to deal with a veritable obstacle course just to exit their vehicle. In fact, a very similar scenario occurred just recently in the Donetsk region in early July. A Russian porcupine tank, so called due to its spiky covering, was involved in an assault on a Ukrainian defense post near the city of Toretsk. Ukraine threw dozens of drones at the tank, struggling for a long time to strike its weak spot. When the Ukrainian forces finally made a breakthrough, the infantry on board the tank, as well as other vehicles involved in the assault, had a very hard time getting out and onto the ground. In fact, those that did manage to escape the tanks were simply sitting ducks for Ukraine's 28th Mechanized Brigade, as reported on the brigade's official Telegram account. After several hits, the tanks tried to disperse along the forest belts to safely land the infantry among the greenery, but the Knights hit hard with FPV, bombers, and even drones with artificial intelligence. In the end, there was almost no one to land, and those who managed to escape were eliminated. Russian tanks are already infamously unpleasant and even inhospitable vehicles for soldiers to operate in. They're often cramped with tight and closed crew compartments, forcing the crew members to contort themselves into awkward, uncomfortable positions, sometimes for many hours at a time, which all takes a toll on mood, morale, and decision-making abilities. And some of these tanks also put their crew in needless danger every single time they climb aboard. The T-72, for example, has one of the biggest design flaws of all time. It uses an auto loader in order to alleviate the need for a human loader as part of the crew. However, to work efficiently, the autoloader has to have direct, easy access to munitions. So, a significant portion of the tank's ammo is stored right close to the crew, including in the compartment below the turret. All the Ukrainians have to do is target the turret. With one clean hit, they can light a fuse on the whole munition supply, sending the turret sky high and triggering a blazing inferno inside the crew compartment. Any unfortunate Russian soldiers on board tanks like the Tu-72 already have to deal with uncomfortable living conditions and the real risk of a horrible fiery death at any moment. With all those spikes and extra stock on top, their lives are getting even harder. That in turn is likely to make them less effective on the battlefield, more prone to making mistakes that could cost their side dearly in crucial encounters with their opponents. Ukraine, meanwhile, has opted for a much more sensible, measured approach. It hasn't just thrown the kitchen sink at its tanks, so to speak, and stuck hundreds of spikes, grills, and other bits and pieces onto their bodies. It has instead found a material that works, rubber, and used it to good effect, protecting its tanks without making them utterly unwieldy or needlessly hazardous to their crew members. It's an excellent example of Ukraine yet again adapting to the war, driving innovation through adversity and opting for a balanced, intelligent approach, while Russia ridicules itself with excess and incompetence. Now, if you'd like to see more of Russians making fools of themselves, check out our recent video detailing how the country's forces have somehow managed to bomb themselves more than 100 times this year so far. Or, to hear more about the stunning spirit of Ukrainian innovation, take a look at our breakdown of Ukraine's bizarre but effective battlefield inventions. And finally, make sure you subscribe to our trusted channel too, so you can stay informed on all the latest news and developments from the Ukraine-Russia conflict and other major military events around the world.